Chapter 22. As I contemplated the vast expanse of ocean ahead and the inadequate craft that was supposed to transport us to our elusive destination, I wouldn't have given Yuval a lead nickel for his slave. As a matter of fact, I seemed more of a liability than an asset, for I was merely dead weight that Yuval had to carry, but I was reckoning without full appreciation of Yuval's resourcefulness. After we had gone about a mile from land, a small saurian rose from the depths, and when his cold, forbidding eyes discovered us, he came for us, his jaws distended, his long neck arched, the water rippling from his sleek body. He presented a most formidable appearance, and though not one of the larger species, he was, I knew, fully as formidable as he appeared and quite capable of ending our voyage almost before it was started. I had encountered these terrible creatures before, and so I knew something of what to expect of blind and senseless ferocity. They are wanton destroyers, killing, apparently, solely for the sake of killing, though I will have to admit that they seem never to be able to satisfy their ravenous hunger, and eat nearly everything they kill. Bound and helpless in the bow of the canoe, I would fall easy prey to the killer, which would doubtless pluck me out and devour me before finishing Yuval. Such were my thoughts as the saurian bore down upon us. Yet there was that about the situation which offered some compensation even for the loss of my life, and I couldn't resist the temptation to take full advantage of it. "You are about to lose your slave," I called to Yuval, "and no one will ever know you owned one. Being a rat didn't pay, Yuval." Yuval made no reply. The saurian was about 100 feet away now and coming rapidly, hissing like a leaky steam valve. The canoe was broadside to him. Yuval swung the craft around, presenting the stern where he sat to the charging reptile. Then he seized one of the long spears we had made and stood up. I hated to admit it, but it certainly seemed that Yuval had plenty of intestinal fortitude, and he unquestionably didn't intend to give up his slave without a struggle. The saurian came straight for him. Yuval poised his 20-foot spear, and when the creature was within 15 feet of the boat, he drove the point of the weapon deep into the reptile's carcass. It was done with all the skill and assurance of a professional matador giving the coup de gracito a bull. Perhaps half a minute the saurian lashed about in an effort to reach Yuval, but the man clinging to his end of the spear skillfully held the canoe in a straight course in front of the beast, so that all its efforts to reach us only succeeded in propelling the craft through the water, until at last, with a final convulsive shudder, it rolled over belly up dead. The point of Yuval's spear had pierced its heart. Had it been a more highly organized creature, it would have died sooner. It is really astonishing the length of time it takes for perceptions of even mortal injuries to reach the brains of some of the lower orders of Pellucidar. I have seen a lady painfully wounded in the tail totally unconscious of its hurt for almost a full minute, but then it is sometimes a matter of 60 feet from the tip of a lady's tail to its minute brain at the far extremity of its huge body. Yuval dragged the carcass to the side of the canoe and hacked off some of its flesh with his stone knife. Before he had finished, the water was alive with terrible, carnivorous fishes and reptiles attracted by the promise of flesh. As they fought over the remains of the saurian, Yuval seized his paddle and drove the canoe out of further immediate danger as rapidly as he could. Then, when we were at a safe distance, he laid aside his paddle and cut the meat of the saurian into thin strips which he strung across one of the spears to dry in the sun. All this time Yuval never addressed me. He resumed his paddling, and I curled up under my shelter and fell asleep. Let the master paddle for the shore, I thought dreamily just before I lost consciousness. When I awoke, we were out of sight of land. Yuval was paddling steadily with long, powerful strokes, yet seeming utterly tireless. I must have slept for a long time, as land 100 miles away, possibly 150, would have been visible, as the atmosphere was quite clear. At a rough guess, I should say that Yuval must have been paddling for at least 15 hours, paddling a 20-foot canoe heavily laden. The strength and endurance of the men of the maritime tribes of Pellucidar is astounding. The canoe was beautifully designed for speed, and although hewn from a single tree trunk, was extremely light. The bottom was a trifle more than an inch thick, and from there the thickness tapered to the gunnels, which flared outward to a breadth of 4 inches. The hull was as smooth as glass, and how they achieved such perfection with the crude implements at their command is a mystery to me. The wood of the tree from which the canoe was hewn is as tough as wrought iron and very oily. To this latter characteristic is partially attributable the ease with which it glides through the water. The cargo was stowed amidships and covered with the enormous leaves of a palm-like jungle tree. Each of us had shelters made of these leaves which we could lower quickly when it was necessary. At least, Yuval could lower his. But with my hands bound, I of course could not lower mine. Nor was there any occasion for me to do so. It is always desirable to be protected from the eternal noonday sun, which has long since burned me to the color of a South Sea Islander. Shortly after the encounter with the Saurian, Yuval laid aside his paddle and came forward to where I sat. "I am going to free your hands, slave," he said. "You will paddle. You will also help me if we are attacked by any of the larger beasts, such as an Azdareth. You will remain always at this end of the canoe. If you come aft, I'll kill you. I shall only tie you up when I wish to sleep. Otherwise, you might kill me." "You need not tie me while you sleep," I replied. "I will not kill you then, I promise you. We might be attacked while you slept, and then you wouldn't have time to free me. You may need me badly, you know." He thought this over for a while, and at last he agreed that I was right. "Anyway, it wouldn't do you any good to kill me," he said, "for you might never find your way to land again. The Bandar Az reaches farther than any man knows. Perhaps it has no farther shore. That is what many men think. No, you would not dare to kill me." "I have promised that I will not kill you while you sleep," I replied. "But some day I will kill you, not because you made me your prisoner, though under the circumstances that is reason enough in itself, but because you kicked me while I lay bound and helpless. For that, Yuval, I will kill you." He had finished removing the bonds from my wrists, and he returned to his seat without commenting on what I had said, but he had something else to say. "There is a paddle forward under the pango's leaves. Take it, slave, and paddle," he commanded. "I shall steer." At first I was minded to refuse, but I saw no good reason for it, as I needed the exercise badly after lying so long in the ant hill, stuffed with grain and honey, so I took up the paddle and went to work. "Faster," commanded Yuval. "Faster, slave." I told him where to go, and it wasn't heaven either. "What you need is a beating," he growled, and with that he started forward with a length of bamboo in his hand. I dropped the paddle and picked up one of the long spears. "Come on, Yuval," I cried. "Come on and beat your slave." "Put down that spear," he commanded. "That is no way for a slave to act. Don't you know anything?" "I don't know how to be a slave," I admitted. "At least not to a stupid clout like you. If you had any brains, neither one of us would have to paddle. But why don't you come on up here and beat me? I'd like nothing better than to have you try it." "Put down that spear and I will," he said. "Go back and sit down. Go way back and sit down." He thought the matter over for a while, and then evidently decided that if he wanted a live slave or a live master, he'd better not push the matter too far. So he went aft again and sat down. So did I, but I didn't paddle. After a while he picked up his paddle and went to work, but he was quite surly about it. He was not a very bright person, and evidently he was much concerned about what attitude he should take with a recalcitrant slave, never having had a slave before. But what troubled him most was the suggestion I had made that it was stupid for either of us to paddle. Finally he broke a long silence by saying, "How could we get anywhere without paddling?" "By sailing," I replied. He didn't know what I meant, for there is no equivalent for sailing in the Polycedarian language. They just haven't reached that stage in progress. They have stone weapons, and they have learned to make fire, but sailing is something their greatest minds have not, as yet, conceived. We had a steady wind blowing in the direction Yuval had been paddling, so I saw no reason why we shouldn't take advantage of it, for after all, paddling under a noonday sun is no joke. "What is sailing?" he asked. "I'll show you. Let me have some of that grass rope you have back there." "What for?" he demanded. "Give it to me, and I'll show you. Do you want the canoe to go without paddling? Or do you want to paddle? It makes no difference to me because I don't intend to paddle anyway." "Listen," he fairly shouted. "I'm sick of this. Don't you know you're my slave? Don't you know you have to paddle if I tell you to? If you don't paddle, I'll come up and tie you up again and give you a good beating. That's what you need. I won't paddle and you won't beat me. If you come up here, I'll run a spear through you. Now toss that rope up and quit being a fool. I want to show you something that'll save you a lot of hard work." He kept on paddling away, and the scowl on his face would have soured cream. The wind freshened. The canoe rose and fell as it topped the waves and dropped into the troughs. The sun beat down out of a cloudless sky. Yuval was dripping sweat from every pore. At last he laid down his paddle, and without a word tossed a coil of rope forward to me. It wasn't easy to rig a sail alone, but finally with spears, a couple of lengths of bamboo, the grass rope, and several pangos leaves from the cargo covering, I fashioned a spread of canvas that would take the wind. Instantly the canoe shot forward, cutting the waves in brave style. "Steer!" I called to Yuval. He started to paddle. "Don't paddle," I told him. "Put your paddle in the water astern with the edge up. Then turn it first one way and then another until you learn what happens. Then you will know how to steer." He could steer all right, but he had been so surprised to see the canoe move forward without paddling that he had become confused. Presently, however, he was steering, but he didn't say anything for a long time. At last he asked, "Suppose the wind should blow from another direction? Then you'd have to paddle," I told him. "If you had a boat properly constructed, you could sail almost into the wind." "Could you build such a canoe?" B asked. "I could show you how to." "You will be a very valuable slave," he said. "You will show me how to build a canoe that will go without paddling." "As long as I am a slave, I'll show you nothing," I replied. Chapter 23. I don't know how long that voyage lasted. I slept many times, but I rigged up a contraption of spears and ropes so designed that Yuval could not approach without awakening me. The wind held steadily in the same quarter. The canoe slipped through the water like a living thing, and Yuval was so pleased that he was almost decent. Several times, yes, many times, we were attacked by the fierce denizens of this Paleolithic sea, but I had recovered my bow and arrows from beneath the cargo covering, and my arrows, together with Yuval's spears, always succeeded in averting the sudden death with which the terrible jaws of these horrific monsters threatened us. The monotony of that voyage was the one thing about it which impressed me, and which I shall never forget. Even the hideous saurians rushing to attack us made less of an impression upon my mind than the deadly monotony of that vast expanse of horizonless water that stretched in all directions about us beyond the limits of human vision. Never a smudge of smoke from some distant steamer, for there were no steamers. Never a sail, for there were no sails, just empty ocean. And then at long last I sighted land dead ahead. At first it was just a dark haze in the distance, but I knew that it could be nothing but land. I called Yuval's attention to it, but though he strained his eyes, he could not discern it. I was not greatly surprised, as I had long since discovered that my eyesight was much keener than that of the Pellucidarians. Perhaps the possession of a marvelous homing instinct lessened the need of long-range vision for them. They had never had to strain their eyes into the distance searching for familiar landmarks. That is just a theory of my own. It may be quite wrong. But this I will say for them: their hearing and their sense of smell were far keener than mine. Not being able to see what I saw, Yuval insisted that I saw nothing. Human nature has not changed at all since the Stone Age. We sailed on, and even though Yuval saw no land, he held our course straight for that distant smudge that slowly took more definite shape, a fact which assured me that it must be the floating island of Ruva. Again, as I had 1,000 times before, I marveled at that amazing instinct, inexplicable alike to those who possess it and to those who do not. How can it be explained? I haven't even a theory. At last Yuval saw the land ahead. "You were right," he admitted grudgingly. "There is land ahead, and it is Ruva, but I don't understand how you could have seen it so much sooner than I." "That is quite easily explained," I replied. "How?" he demanded. "I can see farther than you can." "Nonsense," he snapped. "No one can see any farther than I." What was the use of arguing with a mind like that? Anyway, I had something more important to discuss with him. I fitted an arrow to my bow. "Why are you doing that?" he demanded, glancing quickly around. "There is nothing to shoot." "There is you," I said. For a moment he didn't quite grasp the implication. When he did, he reached for a spear. "Don't touch it," I commanded, "or I'll put an arrow through your heart." He let his hand drop to his side. "You wouldn't dare," he said without much conviction. "And why not? I can see land ahead, and I can reach it without any help from you." "It would do you no good. My people would kill you." "Perhaps and perhaps not," I countered. I should tell them that I am your friend and that you sent me to Ruva to get a rescue party to come to the mainland to save you because you are being held a prisoner. If they are all as stupid as you, they will believe me, and they will take me back to the mainland to guide them to you. When we reach there, I shall pretend to go alone to spy upon the tribe that captured you, and I shall not come back. That is the last they will ever see of me. But you wouldn't kill me, David, he pleaded. We have been friends. We fought side by side. When I could have killed you, I spared your life. But you kicked me in the belly when I was bound and helpless, I reminded him. I am sorry, he wailed. And anyway, I didn't kick you very hard. Oh, please don't kill me, David. Let me live, and I will do everything I can for you. Well, I am not going to kill you, because for some reason I couldn't bring myself to kill a helpless man in cold blood if there were any way to avoid it without jeopardizing my own life. So I will make you a proposition. If I spare your life, you must promise to take me among your people, not as a slave but as a friend whom you will protect from other members of your tribe. And at the first opportunity you will help me return to the mainland. I promise, he said eagerly. A little too eagerly, I thought. I should have killed him then. And I knew it, but I couldn't bring myself to the point of murder. Very well, see that you keep your promise, I said, laying aside my bow. As we neared the floating island of Ruva, it appeared as low, level land, thickly grown with trees. It floated low in the water, its upper surface scarcely more than 5 feet above the waterline, and nowhere could I detect any sign of hills. The coast directly in view was irregular, being broken by small inlets or bays, and into one of these Yuval steered our craft. I took down our sail, and he paddled to shore. It was good to feel ground beneath my feet again and to be able to stretch and move about. Yuval made the canoe fast to a tree, and then, cupping his hands, voiced a high, piercing call. Then he listened. Presently, from far away came an answering cry. Come, said Yuval. They are by the fishing hole. And he started off toward the interior along a well-defined trail that wound through the forest. The trees, of no great size, grow close together. They are of a species I had never seen before, as soft and spongy as some varieties of cactus but without spines or thorns. It is these trees which really not only make the floating islands, of which Ruva is one, but also make them a fit abode for human beings. The roots of the trees, closely interlaced, keep the islands from disintegrating and form a natural basket which holds the soil in which the vegetation grows. The trees also furnish a portion of the food supply of the islanders and all of their supply of fresh water, which they can obtain at any time by either tapping the bole of a tree or cutting off a limb. The tender young shoots are edible, and the fruit of the tree is one of the principal staples of food. There is little other vegetation on the island, and little need for other. Some long grass grows among the trees, and there are several parasitic vines which sport gorgeous blooms. A few varieties of birds live on the island, affording the inhabitants a little variety in diet from the staple tree food and fish, as they eat both their flesh and their eggs. We had walked about a mile when we came to an area that had been partially cleared. A few scattered trees had been left, probably for the purpose of holding the soil together with live roots. In the center of the clearing a hole had been cut, possibly 100 feet in diameter, forming a small pool. Some 50 people of both sexes and all ages were gathered in the clearing. Several of them stood beside the pool with their spears poised, waiting for a fish to swim within striking distance. The fishes must have learned from experience what would happen to them if they swam too close to the shoreline, for the center of the pool, out of range of a spear thrust, fairly teemed with fish. Occasionally a foolish or unwary individual would swim within range, when instantly he would be impaled upon a barbed spearhead. The skill of these spearmen was most uncanny, they never missed, but because of the wariness of the fish, their catches were few. As Yuval and I entered the clearing, the first man to notice us said, "Yuval has returned." Then every eye was turned upon us, but there was no enthusiastic greeting for the returned prodigal. A big fellow came toward us. "You have brought back a slave," he said. It was not a question, merely a statement of fact. "I am not a slave," I rejoined. "Yuval and I were imprisoned together. We fought together. We escaped together. And so in honor, Yuval could not make me his slave." "If you are not a slave, you are an enemy," replied the man. "And enemies we kill." "I would come here as a friend," I said. There is no reason why we should be enemies. As a matter of fact, I can be a very valuable friend. How? He demanded. I can show you how to build canoes that will travel without paddling, I replied. And I can show you how to catch the fish in the middle of the pool, which you are unable to reach with your spears. I don't believe you can do either of those things, he said. For if they could have been done, we could have done them. We know all there is to know about canoes and fishing. No one can teach us anything new. I turned to Yuval. Didn't I make your canoe go without paddling? I demanded. Yuval nodded. Yes, it went even faster than I could paddle, but I can show them how to do that. Yes, I replied. But you can only show them how it is done when the wind is directly behind you, but I can show them how to build canoes in which they can travel no matter in what direction the wind is blowing. That you cannot do. Is that true, Yuval? Asked the man. Yes, Rotai, it is true, replied Yuval. And can he catch fish from the middle of the pool? That I do not know. Rotai turned to me. If you can do these things at all, he said, you can do them just as well if you are a slave. But I won't do them if I am a slave. I won't show you how to either. You will or we'll kill you, snapped Rotai. If you kill me, you'll never learn how to do it, I reminded him. While we had been talking, a number of men had congregated about us, interested listeners. Now one of them spoke up. We should accept this man as a friend, Rotai, he said, on condition that he teaches us these things. Yes, said another. Ulvan has spoken words of wisdom. I do not believe that the stranger can do these things, and if he cannot, we can either make him a slave or kill him. Quite a discussion ensued in which everybody took part. Some were opposed to accepting a stranger as a friend, but the majority of them agreed with Ulvan, who seemed to me to be by far the most intelligent member of the company. Finally someone said, Rotai is chief. Let him decide. Very well, said Rotai, I shall decide. Then he turned to me. Go now and catch a fish from the center of the pool. I shall have to make some preparation, I said. I haven't everything that I need. You see, remarked one of the dissenters, that he is unable to do it. He is trying to gain time so that he may escape. Nonsense, said Ulvan. Let him make his preparations, and then if he fails it will be time enough to say that he cannot do it. Rotai nodded. Very well, he said. Let him make his preparations, but you, Ulvan, must stay with him always to see that he does not try to escape. If he cannot do it, he shall be my slave, said Yuval, for I brought him here. If he can't do it, he'll be killed, said Rotai, for trying to make fools of us. As soon as I was turned over to Ulvan, I told him that I wanted a light, stout cord about 30 feet long. Come with me, he said, and led me off along another trail beyond the pool. Presently we came to a second clearing in which were the sleeping shelters of the tribe. They were small beehive huts, entirely covered with large leaves. At the bottom of each but was a single opening, and into one of these Ulvan crawled, emerging presently with a length of the braided grass rope such as I had seen in Yuval's canoe. It was far too heavy for my purpose, but as it was made up of a number of smaller strands braided together, I saw that by unbraiding it I could get a single strand that would answer my purpose. This, he permitted me to do, and I finally had a light cord about 40 feet long. Thus equipped, I returned to the pool. Here I fastened one end of the cord securely to the butt of an arrow and tied the other end around my right wrist. Then I stepped to the end of the pool and fitted my arrow to the bow. Every eye was upon me now as I stepped to the edge of the pool. Milling around in the center of the pool, leaping out of the water, were literally hundreds and hundreds of fish, but none of them approached within spear length of the shore. I coiled the slack of the rope carefully at my feet, raised the bow and drew the arrow back its full length. I was very nervous, and well I might have been, for I had never tried this thing before, and I did not know if the arrow could carry true with the weight of the rope trailing behind it, and my life depended upon success. I took careful aim at a spot where the fish were thickest. The bow twanged and the arrow sped straight for its mark. A fish jumped into the air and sounded. The rope paid out rapidly. I braced my feet and prepared for the shock, and when it came I was almost jerked into the pool, but I managed to keep my footing. I let the fish play for a while without endeavoring to draw him in, for I was none too sure of the strength of my line, even though it had withstood the first great shock. I wanted to tire him, and every time that there was a little slack in the rope I pulled it in. Finally the struggling ceased, and the fish floated to the surface, belly up. I pulled it ashore and handed it to Rotai, who immediately demanded that I make bows and arrows for every warrior of the tribe. Right there we ran into a snag. There was no growth on Ruva suitable for making bows. The result was that I was kept busy shooting fish. Rotai had to admit that I had taught them something, and his attitude toward me relaxed a little, but Yuval was still pretty sore at me. He wanted me as his slave, and he wanted all the credit for what I had done. Ulvan told me that Yuval was very unpopular, and that I was fortunate in not having him for a master. The fish that I caught they cleaned and smoked, and when they thought they had a sufficient supply, Rotai insisted that I show them how to build a canoe that would travel through the water without paddling. Immediately I was faced by an insurmountable obstacle. No trees suitable for canoe building grew upon Ruva or any of the other floating islands. All of their canoes had been built upon the mainland where the proper wood could be found. To build a canoe was a terrific undertaking, necessitating an expedition in which some 20 or 30 men were often absent from Ruva for 100 sleeps or more. The canoes would be roughly hewn on the mainland and then towed to Ruva, where the long and arduous job of finishing was completed. These canoes remained in families for generations. Ulvan told me that his had been in his family for 10 generations at least. They are passed on from the father to the eldest son. As the women and children seldom leave the islands, only enough canoes are needed to carry the men. A new canoe is built only when the number of men in the tribe exceeds the carrying capacity of the canoes they have. And this, Ulvan told me, seldom occurs more than a couple of times during the lifetime of a man, as the casualties among the warriors just about balance the birth rate of males. Chapter 24. I shall not bore you with a detailed description of my attempts to convert one of their canoes into a sailboat. I discovered, after considerable experimenting, that I could harden the wood of the native trees over a bed of hot coals, and with this makeshift material, I constructed a keel and an outrigger. My only tools were some large shells with sharp edges, a stone knife, a stone chisel, and a hammer of stone. Fortunately for me, the wood was very soft and I worked it into shape before hardening it. I made the keel with a broad flange at the top and fastened it to the bottom of the canoe with fire-hardened wooden pegs which I knew would expand when wet. For my mast, I spliced length of bamboo to the proper height and then bound 3 of these together with grass cord. The sail was perhaps the most difficult problem, but I solved it by building a primitive loom and teaching a couple of the women how to weave, using a long, tough grass. While I was working on the canoe, I became pretty well acquainted with the members of the tribe and their customs. There were about 40 families on this island, averaging about 4 members to the family. There were also 25 or 30 slaves, men and women from the white races of the mainland. These slaves attended to practically all of the manual labor, but their life was not a difficult one, and for the most part they were well treated. The men are monogamous and very proud of their bloodline. Under no circumstances will they mate with a white, as they consider the white race far inferior to theirs. I could never quite accustom myself to this reversal of the status of the two races from what I had always been accustomed to, but it really was not as difficult as it might appear, for I must admit that the blacks treated us with far greater toleration here than our dark-skinned races are accorded on the outer crust. Perhaps I was getting a lesson in true democracy. The canoe upon which I had been working had been drawn up on the seashore about half a mile from the village. Usually, there were a number of villagers hanging around watching me, and Ulvan was always with me, having been detailed by Rotai to keep a watch on me and prevent me from escaping. Once, while Ulvan and I were alone, I saw a canoe approaching in the distance, and called Ulvan's attention to it. At first he couldn't see it, but when it came closer, and he could recognize it as a canoe, he showed considerable excitement. "They are probably Kovans," he said. "It is a raiding party." "There are 3 more canoes coming into sight now behind the first one," I told him. "That is bad," said Ulvan. "We must return to the village at once and warn Rotai." When Ulvan had reported to Rotai, the latter sent boys to the fishing pool and to other parts of the island where he knew his warriors to be, and soon all were congregated in the village. The women and children were sent into the huts. The men stood about nervously, an unorganized crowd presenting a fine target for the spears of the enemy. "You are not going to remain here, are you?" I asked Rotai. "This is our village. We shall remain here and defend it, he replied. Why don't you go out and meet them? I asked. You could take them by surprise. Send a scout out to see what trail they are taking and then hide your warriors on either side of it. Then when the Kovans walk into your trap, you can fall upon them in force from both sides. They will be surprised and disorganized, and those whom you do not kill will run back to their canoes as fast as they can go. It is not necessary for you to let them reach your village at all. All my life I have fought when raiders came, replied Rotai with dignity. And I and my father and his father before him have always held the warriors in the village to await attack. That doesn't make it right, I said. As a matter of fact, you have always been doing it in the wrong way. If you'll let me have 10 men, I'll stop those Kovans before they come anywhere near your village. I believe him, said one of the principal men of the village. He has not deceived us yet. His plan is a good one, said Ulvan. Very well, said Rotai. Take 10 men and go and see if you can stop the Kovans. The rest of us will remain here to fight with them if you fail. I shall not fail, I said. Then I selected Ulvan and 9 other men, and together we started back toward the ocean. I sent 1 man ahead to reconnoiter, with orders to report back to me as soon as he had discovered what trail the Kovans took after they landed. They will take this trail, said Ulvan. They always do. Do they raid you often? I asked. Yes, he replied. They were here only a few sleeps before you came. They killed several of our warriors and stole some of our slaves. Among them was a woman slave that belonged to me. I did not like to lose her, for she was very beautiful, and my mate was very fond of her. She said that she was an Amazite, and I have heard from other slaves that the women of Amaz are considered very beautiful. She told my woman that she and her mate lived in a country called Sari. What was her name? I asked. Before Ulvan could reply, my scout came racing back, breathless. The Kovans have landed, he said. They are coming along this trail. How many of them are there? I asked. About 20, he replied. I posted my men on either side of the trail, well hidden behind trees. Each of the warriors carried 2 spears and a stone knife. I told them not to move or to make any sound until I gave the signal. Then they were to stand up and each hurl one of his spears, immediately charging into close quarters with his remaining spear. I climbed a tree from which I could not only see my own men but watched the trail for a short distance along which the Kovans were approaching, quite oblivious of the fate that awaited them. I had not long to wait, for presently a hideously painted warrior came into view, and close behind him in single file followed the others. They were armed precisely as were the Reuvens, 2 spears and a stone knife, and they were of the same race of fine-looking blacks. Only in their war paint did they differ in appearance from the warriors of Ruva. Silently I fitted an arrow to my bow and waited until the entire file was well within the ambush. I bent the bow and took careful aim. This was savage warfare of the Stone Age. Of course we lacked poison gas and we couldn't drop bombs on women and children in hospitals, but in our own primitive way we could do fairly well, and so I released my arrow, and as it sunk deep into the body of the last man in the file, I gave the signal for the Reuven warriors to attack. With savage war cries they rose and hurled their spears. The Kovans, taken entirely by surprise, were thrown into confusion, to which I added by driving 6 more arrows into as many of them in rapid succession. 11 of the 20 went down in the first onslaught. The remaining 9 turned to flee, but the trail was narrow and blocked by the dead and wounded. The survivors stumbled and fell as they attempted to climb over one another and their dead and dying comrades in their mad effort to escape, with the result that they fell easy prey to the Reuven warriors, who rushed in with fiendish yells and speared them to the last man. As I dropped from the tree, they were driving their spears into the hearts of the wounded. Not a Kovan escaped. Not one of my men received even so much as a scratch. Bearing the weapons of the vanquished, we marched back to the village in triumph. When the villagers saw us, they looked at us in astonishment. "Was there no fight?" demanded Rotai. "What became of the Kovans? Are they following you?" "The Kovans are all dead," said Ulvan. "There were 20 of them and we killed them all." "You killed 20 Kovans without losing a man?" demanded Rotai. "Such a thing has never happened before." "You can thank David," said Ulvan. "We did only what he told us to do, and we were victorious." Rotai made no comment. With the others, he listened to the account of the victorious warriors, which lost nothing of glory in the telling, but I will admit that every last man of them gave me full credit. At last Rotai spoke. The warriors of Ruva will feast in celebration of the victory over the Kovans. Let the slaves prepare food and tumal, that the warriors may drink and be happy. Only the warriors of Ruva shall partake of this feast. Some of the slaves were detailed to prepare the food and make the tumal, an alcoholic drink of some potency. The remaining male slaves were sent to carry the dead Kovans to the sea, where they would be thrown to the fierce denizens of the deep. As soon as I could get Ulvan's attention, I asked him the name of the slave woman who had been captured by the Kovans. Amar, he said. That was her name. I couldn't tell whether I was disappointed or not. From his description, I had thought that it might be Dien, for she was beautiful, she had been born in Amaz, and she had lived with her mate in Sari. But of course many women have been born in Amaz, and many of them have been taken as mates by the men of Sari, and as nearly all Amazite women are beautiful, the description might have fitted many besides Dien. And anyhow, how could Dien be on one of the floating islands? 3 sleeps intervened before the feast was ready, for the tumal had to ferment, and special foods had to be prepared, many of which cooked for long periods underground wrapped in pangos leaves and laid upon hot stones. I returned to my work upon the canoe, and Ulvan remained with me. He was still very much elated over our victory, which he said was absolutely unprecedented in the memory of any living Reuven. We not only killed them all, and have all their weapons, but we have 4 fine canoes in addition. Never has anything like this happened, and you are the one who did it, David. Chapter 25. Ever since I had come to Ruva, I had noticed that Yuval hung around a girl called Oare. There were several other young bucks after her, but she showed no preference for any of them. I think Oare was something of a Paleolithic gold digger. She wanted a man with a slave, and not one of her suitors owned one. Thus a situation was created which did not tend to increase Yuval's love for me. I think he spent a great deal of time doing nothing but hating me. I used to catch him glaring at me, and I think he was trying to screw up his courage to a pitch where he could denounce me and claim me as his slave. His fear of me was purely psychological, an unreasoning complex, for he had proved in his encounters with the great Saurians which had attacked us during our voyage from the mainland to Ruva that he was no coward. I think we have all seen examples of this type of cowardice many times. I have known men who could face death coolly but were in mortal terror of some little woman half their size, and I have known heroes who were afraid of mice. Possibly because they didn't like him, the men of the tribe made Yuval the butt of crude jokes because of his profitless attention to Oare. And I may say that Stone Age humor is often raw. However, much of it has come down intact for perhaps 1,000,000 years to the present day on the outer crust. I recognized in many of the Paleolithic jokes old friends with which I had been well acquainted back in Hartford, Connecticut. Finally the food and tumal for the feast were about ready, and Rotai announced that the warriors would retire to their huts and that after the sleep the feast would be served. As Ulvan had been detailed to keep watch over me, I had to go into his hut with him, and while I was waiting for sleep to come, I overheard a conversation in a nearby hut. A man was speaking, and he was trying to persuade a woman to enter the hut with him, which would have consummated the simple marriage ceremony of the Reuvens, but the woman was adamant in her refusal. "No," she said. "I will not mate with a man who has no slave." "I have a slave," replied the man, and I recognized the voice of Yuval. The woman laughed scornfully. "You keep your slave well hidden, Yuval," she said. "What is it, a man or a woman? Or did the brave Yuval capture a little girl?" "My slave is a great warrior," replied Yuval. "He is the man called David. Did you not see me bring him to the island? But he said that he was your friend, not your slave, and you did not deny it." "I did not deny it because he had threatened to kill me if I claimed him as my slave." "When you claim him," said Oare, "I will become your mate, for the man would make a valuable slave." "Yes," assented Yuval, but there was not much conviction in his tone. He had reason to doubt that I would make a very tractable slave. "When you have your slave you may ask me again," said Oare, and then she must have gone away, for I heard no more, and presently I fell asleep. A boy came and awakened us, saying that Rotai was awake and was summoning the warriors to the feast. I followed Ulvan out of the hut, and found a place beneath the shade of a tree where I could watch the proceedings. Leaves had been laid on the ground, covering a strip about 3 feet wide and 25 feet long. This was the banquet table, and along the length of it the slaves were piling food and setting great joints of bamboo filled with tumal, the warriors arranging themselves along both sides. Rotai, who was standing at the center of one side of the spread, was looking about as though searching for someone. Suddenly his eyes alighted upon me and he called to me. "Come, David," he said, "and join the other warriors in the feast." It was then that Yuval spoke up, finding his courage at last. "Slaves do not eat with the warriors of Ruva, Rotai," he said. "What do you mean?" demanded Rotai. "I mean that the man David is my slave. I captured him on the mainland and brought him to Ruva. I have let him play at being a free man long enough. Now I claim him as my slave." There was a rumble of disapproval, and then Rotai spoke. "Even if David were your slave, by his act he has won his liberty, and I, Rotai, the chief of Ruva, give him his liberty, which it is my right to do. I give him his liberty and I make him a warrior of Ruva." "I shall not feast with a white slave," exclaimed Yuval, and turning he stalked away. He took a few steps and then stopped and wheeled about. "If I cannot have him as my slave, I can at least kill him, for he is an enemy of Ruva, and kill him I shall." "Have you forgotten that you ate grain and honey with me in the hill of the giant ants, Yuval?" I called to him. "You had better come and eat now. You can kill me afterward, and you will need the tumal to give you courage. But don't forget, Yuval, that I have promised to kill you." "Why have you promised to kill him?" demanded Rotai. "Because while I thought he was my friend, he bound my hands behind me while I slept, and when I awoke he told me that I was his slave, and he kicked me in the ribs while I lay on the ground helpless. It was because of that kick that I promised to kill him." "You may kill him in self-defense but not otherwise," said Rotai. "And see that you don't pick a quarrel with him," he added. "I haven't so many warriors that I can afford to lose even one unnecessarily." Now, at a sign from Rotai, the warriors seated themselves cross-legged upon the ground before the feast. There were no knives or forks, for each warrior had 2 good hands, and each made the most of both of them. There was not much conversation, for the feasters were too busy eating and drinking. The women and children and slaves formed a circle about us, hungrily watching us devour the food. When we were through, they would come and finish what remained. It was not long before the feasters began to get pretty high on tumal, and correspondingly noisy. I drank no tumal, and when I had satisfied my hunger I got up and strolled away, and no sooner had I left than Yuval came and seated himself at the feast. As I watched him I saw that he ate very little, but that he was drinking quantities of tumal, and I knew then that I must be on my guard. I wanted to go and work on the canoe, which was nearly completed, but I could not because Ulvan couldn't go with me. The slaves were all busy, and so I sat apart by myself, for I had learned long since that the less you have to do with the women of primitive men the better you are liked. Many of them even resent an outsider talking to their women, but after a while Ore came over and sat down beside me. While she didn't belong to anybody, she had several suitors, so that a tete-a-tete with her wasn't a particularly healthful occupation. I was compensated for this, however, by the fact that I knew it would make Yuval madder than ever. "Yuval is going to kill you," she said. "He told me so just before he went to fill up on tumal." "Why are you warning me?" I asked. "Because I don't like Yuval and I hope you kill him," she replied. "Then he can't bother me anymore." "But you would have become his mate if he had owned a slave," I said. "How could you do that if you hated him?" "He could have died suddenly," she said with a smile, "and then I would have owned the slave. After that I could have mated with the man I want, and then I would have had my man and my slave both." "You would have killed him?" I asked. She shrugged. "He would have died," she said. Ore was way ahead of her time. She had been born about 1,000,000 years too soon, or at least on the wrong side of the crust. She had highly advanced ideas for a girl of the Stone Age. "Well, I hope you get your man, Ore," I said, "but I'd hate to be in his sandals." She laughed and rose. Then she said excitedly in a whisper, "Here comes Yuval now. I think I'll wait and see the fun." "I would if I were you," I said, "for somebody is going to be killed. You ought to enjoy that." Yuval came toward us a little unsteadily. His habitual scowl was even blacker than usual. "What are you doing trying to steal my woman?" he demanded. "Is she your woman?" I asked. "I'll say I'm not," said Oware. "She's going to be," said Yuval. "And anyway, no dirty white slave is going to talk to a Reuven woman while I'm around." I wasn't going to be tricked into attacking him no matter what he said, for Rotai had made it quite clear that it wouldn't be safe for me to kill him in other than self-defense. "Why don't you fight, you dirty coward?" he shouted. By this time the attention of others had been attracted, and members of the tribe were gathering to form a circle about us. Some of the men were pretty drunk, and they urged on first Yuval and then me. Like Ora, they wanted to see a fight and a killing. Rotai and Ulvan were among the spectators. Yuval was applying to me every vile Pellucidarian epithet that he could recall, and he recalled plenty, and most of them were pretty raw fighting words, if there ever were any. "What's the matter?" demanded Ulvan. "Are you afraid of him, David?" "Rotai told me that I could only kill him in self-defense," I said, "and he hasn't attacked me yet. Words can't kill me, but if I could use my fists on him, that would help some." "You can use your fists," said Rotai, "but don't either of you draw a weapon." "You don't care then what I do to him just so long as I do it with my hands?" I asked. Rotai nodded, and with permission granted, I stepped in and planted a right on Yuval's nose. Blood spurted in all directions, and Yuval went practically crazy with rage. He had gone down with the blow, sort of stunned and dazed, but when he regained his senses he leaped up and down like a jumping jack, beating his breast and screaming. Then he came for me. I dropped him again with a body blow to the solar plexus. He was a pretty sick man when he staggered to his feet, but when he saw everyone laughing at him, he lost the last shred of his self-control, whipped out his stone knife and came for me with murder in his eye. Now was my opportunity. I could kill him now, according to the rules that Rotai had made. But as he came for me, I did not draw my own knife. I wanted to be absolutely in the clear, for I knew that if I killed him there would be some that would insist that I pay with my life. They wouldn't like the idea of a white man living among them who had killed a black. He might become too arrogant. "Your knife! Your knife!" cried Ulvan. "Draw your knife, David." But I didn't have to draw my knife yet, and I hoped that I would not have to draw it at all. I knew a great many jujitsu tricks and holds, and I felt that Yuval was in for the surprise of his life. As he closed with me, I used a very simple trick for disarming him, and then I got his head beneath one arm and started whirling him around. He was absolutely helpless. His feet flew off the ground and his body described a circle in the air. Faster and faster I whirled. Then suddenly I lifted him and let him go. His body flew completely over the heads of the spectators and lit heavily on the ground beyond. I hurried through the crowd to his side. He lay with his head bent under, quite motionless. Immediately the crowd followed and formed a new circle about us. I put my ear to Yuval's chest and listened. Then I rose and turned toward Rotai. "He is dead," I said. "You will all bear witness that I killed him in self-defense." "And with your bare hands?" exclaimed Ulvan in evident amazement. "Have slaves take the body down to the ocean," said Rotai, and turning on his heel he walked away. The fight seemed to have had a sobering effect upon most of the warriors. Some of them gathered around me and felt of my muscles. "You must be very strong," said one. "It doesn't take a great deal of strength," I said. "It is just in knowing how." Immediately they wanted to be taught, so I showed them a few of the simpler holds: how to disarm a man attacking with a knife, how to throw a man, how to take a prisoner and force him to accompany you, and at the same time render him helpless to harm you. When I was through, they immediately started practicing on one another, and they were still at it when Ulvan and I started back to the seashore to go to work upon the canoe. I was anxious to complete the work as I hoped to be able to use the canoe to sail to the mainland and escape from Ruva. I had a plan which I proceeded to explain to Ulvan, although I did not tell him that its real purpose was to permit me to escape. "When this canoe is finished," I said, "a party of us can sail to the mainland and get a log from which I can make a better boat. We can tow it back to Ruva and do all the work on it here." "That is a good idea," said Ulvan, "but we shall have to wait until the islands float within sight of the mainland." "Why?" I asked. "Because we could never find the mainland otherwise." "Do you mean to say that you don't know in what direction the mainland lies?" Bandar Ezi is very large, he said, and the islands are constantly drifting. We never go to the mainland unless we can see it. Of course, it makes no difference then how far Ruva drifts away from us, for Ruva is our homeland, and no matter where it lies, we can always return to it. Will it be long before we sight the mainland? I asked. I do not know, he replied. Occasionally, there are times when babies grow to manhood without ever sighting the mainland, and then there are times when we are in sight of it constantly for hundreds and hundreds of sleeps. My chances of escape looked pretty slim, if I had to wait for 20 years of outer crust time before we sighted the mainland again. I was pretty blue. Presently Ulvan exclaimed jubilantly, "Why, of course we can reach the mainland. Why didn't we think of it before? Your home is on the mainland. All you would have to do would be to steer a course for your home." I shook my head. That is something I could not do. You see, I am not a Pellucidarian. I am from another world, and I could not steer a straight course to my home as you Pellucidarians can. That seemed very strange to Ulvan. It was beyond his comprehension. Another hope was blasted. I seemed now irretrievably doomed to a life of exile upon this floating bit of earth. I might never again see my beloved Sari, never renew my search for Dien the Beautiful. I worked on in silence upon the canoe. Ulvan helped me as best he could, for this was work such as a warrior might do. We had not spoken for some time when he said, "Oh, by the way, David, that slave girl I was telling you about had another name. Amar was the name my mate gave her. Her real name was Dien." Chapter 26. Now my entire outlook on life changed. I knew definitely where Dien was. I was sure that she was alive, and I had every reason to believe that she was comparatively safe among the Kovans, for Ulvan assured me that they treated their slaves well. But how was I to rescue her? First I would have to reach Kovier, and that I could not do alone for it had drifted out of sight of Ruva. Usually, Ulvan said, they were in sight of one another, but some freak of current or wind had separated them. Eventually they would float together again. On occasions they had even touched each other. Formerly the fighting had been continuous when this occurred, but both tribes had been so depleted by this constant warfare that, for many generations, truces had been declared whenever the two islands approached within spear throw of each other. At last I hit upon a plan, and when we returned to the village to eat I went directly to Rotai. "I have a plan," I said, "whereby you may make a successful raid upon Virginia. With the loss of the 20 warriors we killed, their fighting strength has been weakened, and if you will let me help you plan the attack, we should be able to recapture all of the slaves they took from you and doubtless take all of their slaves as well." Rotai was very much interested. He thought the plan an excellent one and said that he would embark upon the expedition after the next sleep. Later, I was talking the matter over with Ulvan when a discouraging thought occurred to me. "How," I asked him, "can you find Kovier if you cannot see it, any more than you can find the mainland when it is out of sight, for Kovier is not your home?" "Some of our women were born on Kovier," he said, "and captured by us. We will take one of them with us in one of the canoes, and she will direct our passage." "How did the Kovans who came to raid Ruva find the island?" I asked. "Unquestionably, at least one of them was born on Ruva," replied Ulvan, "and doubtless stolen in a raid while he was a small child. We often capture Kovan boys and raise them among us as our own warriors for the same purpose. It happened that the last 2 we had were killed in a recent raid, but we have several Kovan women." It seemed to me an eternity before the expedition was prepared to set out, but at last all was in readiness and 50 warriors manned 5 canoes, one of which was that which I had converted into a lateen-rigged outrigger. Rotai, the chief, and Ulvan were in this canoe with me, and we had with us a woman who had been born on Kovia to point the way. I was not a little concerned as to the success of my venture. I had wanted to experiment with my craft before setting forth upon this considerable voyage, but Rotai would not hear of it. Now that all was ready, he wanted to get started without further delay. I did not know what speed I could attain, and there was a question as to whether the paddle-driven canoes might outdistance us. Also, I was not at all sure as to the seaworthiness of my craft. I was fearful that a good gust of wind might capsize it, for it carried considerable canvas. The Ruvans were still skeptical about the possibility of making a canoe move through the water without paddles. 50 pair of eyes were on me as I raised the sail and took my place in the stern with the steering paddle. Gradually the boat got under way with a brisk breeze. The warriors in the other canoes bent to their paddles, and the little armada was under way. "It moves!" exclaimed Rotai in an awestruck tone. "It is pulling away from the other canoes," said Ulvan. "Will wonders never cease?" exclaimed one of the older men. "What will they think of next? To think that I should live to see a thing like this." The warriors in the other canoes were paddling furiously, but still we drew away from them. I sailed on, occasionally looking back to note the position of the other canoes, and when I thought we were separated almost too far for safety, I brought the canoe into the wind and waited. We were a savage-looking band, for the Reuvens had donned their war paint and were hideously decorated. They had even insisted upon painting me, and when Ulvan got through with me I could have passed for a full-blooded Reuven, for he had succeeded in smearing every inch of my body with pigments of one color or another. The canoes were well stocked with spears, each warrior having brought 3, and I had made for myself an additional supply of arrows and one of the short, javelin-like spears which I prefer. I discussed with Rotai his plan of attack when we should have landed on Covier. He said that they would do as they had always done, march in a body straight to the village which lay in the center of the island. If the Covans chanced to have seen us approach, they would be ready for us. If not, we might take them partially by surprise. I didn't like this plan at all, and finally persuaded him to adopt one which I felt certain would assure us far greater success and which I explained to him in detail. He acceded with some reluctance, and he acceded at all solely because of the success I had had in our skirmish with the Covans who had come to raid Ruva. I was the first to sight the island, which was similar in all respects to Ruva except that it was a little larger. As we approached it we saw no sign of life, and I was in hope that we might be able to surprise the village, for my plan of attack would prove far more successful in such an event. I came to a short distance from the island and lay to waiting for the other canoes to overtake us. Ulvan and I lowered the sail, and the warriors shipped their paddles, and when the other canoes came abreast of us we all moved in together toward the shore. When we had disembarked, Rotai asked me to explain my plan of attack to the entire company, and when I had done so, we started into the forest in a long, thin line which gradually opened out as we approached the village. I took a position in the center of the line, Rotai in the center of the left wing, Ulvan in the center of the right wing. We kept the men close enough together so that they could see and pass on hand signals, which I explained to them and which were very simple. I sent one scout ahead to the village with explicit instructions as to what he was to do. We moved forward in absolute silence, and when we had advanced about 2 miles my scout returned to me. He told me that the village was but a short distance ahead, that he had reached the edge of the clearing, and from what he could see he believed that the warriors were sleeping or away, for he saw only women, children, and slaves outside the huts. I now gave the signal to start the enveloping movement, and it was passed on to right and left by hand signals. The center of the line moved forward now very slowly while the wings curved inward as they advanced more rapidly, the idea being to entirely surround the village before attacking. When those in the center of the line reached a point where they could see the clearing, they lay down and hid, but always they kept in sight of the warrior next to them. Finally, the signal that I awaited came. It meant that the 2 wings had joined on the opposite side of the village. So far, not a Covan was aware that an enemy was upon the island. Now I gave the signal to charge. It was simply a war cry that was taken up by all the Reuven warriors as simultaneously, we dashed toward the village. The women and children, terrified, started to run first in one direction and then in another, but always they found Reuven warriors blocking their escape. Now the Covan warriors came crawling from their huts, heavy-eyed with sleep. Taken wholly by surprise, they fell easy prey to our spearmen. Only a few of them fell before the others surrendered. I had expected to see ruthless slaughter, but such was not the case. As Rotai explained to me afterward, if they killed all the Covans they would have no one to raid for slaves and women, and even now, in victory, he exacted but little tribute. He demanded the slaves that had been stolen from Ruva and an equal number of Covan slaves, as well as 3 young boys who would be brought up as Reuvens. My first concern was to look for Dien, but she was not among the slaves who were in the village. I questioned the chief, and he told me that a manslave had stolen a canoe and escaped, taking Dien with him. "He was a man from Suvi," said the chief. "I have forgotten his name." Was it Dugad? I asked. Yes, he said. That was it. Dugad was his name. Once more my high hopes were dashed. And now my quest seemed hopeless, and I was further harassed by the thought that Dian was again in the power of her nemesis. What was I to do? I had a sailboat, but I could not find the mainland, nor was there anyone to guide me to it. Presently I conceived a forlorn hope, and going among the Kovan slaves, I questioned each one, asking him from what country he came, and finally one of them, a girl, said she was from Suvi. Are there any other Suvian slaves here? I asked. No, she said, not since Dugad escaped. I went then to the chief of the Reuvens. Rotai, I said, I have tried to serve you well. I have taught you how to catch the fish in the center of the pool. I have shown you how you may make your canoes go without paddling, and I have helped you to win 2 battles and take many slaves. Yes, he said, you have done all these things, David. You are a good warrior. I want to ask a favor in return, I said. What is it? He asked. I want you to promise to let me return to the mainland and my own country whenever I can. He shook his head. I cannot do that, David, he said. You are now a Reuven warrior, and no Reuven may go to live in any other country. I have another favor to ask then, I said, that I think you will not find too difficult to grant. What is it? He asked. I should like to have a slave, I said. Certainly, he agreed. When we return to Ruva, you may select one of the slaves that we have taken today. I do not want any that you have selected, I said. I want that girl over there. And I pointed to the slave from Suvi. Rotai raised his eyebrows and hesitated for a moment, but then he said, Why not? You are both white. You should have a mate, and you cannot mate with a Reuven. Well, I would let him think what he pleased, just so long as I acquired a slave from Suvi. I walked over to the girl. You are my slave, I said. Come with me. What is your name? Lubra, she said. But I do not want to be your slave. I do not want to go with you. I belong to a woman here, and she is kind to me. I shall be kind to you, I said. You need have no fear of me. But I still do not want to go with you. I would rather die. You are going with me nevertheless, and you are not going to die, and you are not going to be harmed in any way. You may believe me that you are going to be very glad that I selected you. Well, she had to come along with me. There was nothing she could do about it, but she was not very happy. I didn't want to tell her what I had in mind, for the success of the plan I had concocted depended solely upon the secrecy with which I could carry it out. The warriors of Ruva ate in the village of the Kovans, who were their unwilling hosts, and then we returned to the ocean with our slaves and embarked for Ruva, and Lubra, the slave girl from Suvi, went with me. The wind had risen since we landed on Kovier, and now it was blowing half a gale and the seas were commencing to run high. It looked to me like a risky venture to embark in the face of such ominous weather, but the Reuvens seemed to think nothing of it. The wind had not only freshened but it had changed, so that now I could run directly before it, and our canoe fairly flew through the water. We didn't have to wait for the others this time, and they were soon specks far astern. The warriors who were fortunate enough to have been selected as the crew of this boat were highly enthusiastic. They had never traveled so fast before, and they had never traveled at all without hard work. Now they just sat idle and contented, and watched the waves go by. But I was not so contented. My improvised mast and cordage were being subjected to terrific strain. There were creakings and squeakings that filled me with apprehension, and the sea and the wind were rising. I can tell you that I breathed a sigh of relief when I glimpsed Ruva in the distance, although there was still plenty of time for disaster to overtake us before we ran into one of her sheltering coves. The sky was overcast with ominous clouds. The air about us was filled with spindrift. The wind howled and shrieked like malevolent demons seeking to terrify those whom they were about to destroy. The seas became mountainous. I glanced at my companions, and I was aware that for the first time they were showing marked concern. I was considerably worried myself, for I didn't see how this frail craft could possibly survive the fury of the storm. Why my sail and mast did not carry away, I still cannot conceive, but they held. The great flowing seas never quite engulfed us, and we drew rapidly nearer and nearer the shore. As we came closer, I witnessed a strange and terrifying sight. The entire island, as far as I could see, was rising and falling as though in the throes of a terrific and continuous earthquake. Mountainous waves were breaking on the low shoreline and carrying tons of water into the forest. Pieces of the island were breaking off and disintegrating. How could we hope to make a landing under such conditions? And then Rotai voiced that very doubt. "We can't land here," he said. "We must try to make the lee side of the island." I knew that that would be impossible. To change our course now would throw us into the trough of these enormous seas, and the craft would be capsized almost immediately. There was just one slender hope, and I held my course straight for that tossing, leaping shoreline. We were almost upon it. I held my breath, and I imagined the Reuvens did likewise. We rose to the crest of a great sea. With my stone knife I cut the sheet, and the sails streamed out, flapping in the gale. We were only a few yards from the shore toward which we were rushing with the speed of an express train, and for the few seconds that were required to assure the success of my mad scheme, the canoe clung to the crest of a great wave and we were carried inland and hurled among the trees of the forest. Why no one was killed is still a mystery to me. Some were injured, but the rest of us managed to hold the canoe from being carried back into the ocean by the receding waters. Before another large wave descended upon us, we stumbled deeper into the forest. We were being constantly hurled to the ground by the upheaval of the ground beneath us, and sometimes a wave would reach us but broken and rendered harmless by the trees of the forest. At last we reached the village, where we found most of the huts lying collapsed upon the ground, while the Reuvens who had not accompanied the expedition, and the slaves, lay prone and terrified in the clearing. My fear was that the entire island would disintegrate. I did not see how it could withstand the terrific forces that were wrenching at it, pulling it this way and that, raising and lowering it, twisting and turning it. I asked Ulvan what he thought our chances were. "I have seen but one such storm before in my lifetime," he said. "Portions of the island were broken off and lost, but the main part of the island withstood the worst that wind and sea could do. If the storm does not last too long, I think that we are safe." "And what about the men in the other canoes?" I asked. Ulvan shrugged. "Some of them may reach shore," he said, "but it is more likely that none of them ever will. It was your sail that saved us, David." Chapter 27. That storm meant more to me than the destruction of Ruva or its menace to my own existence, for I knew that out there somewhere among those mountainous waves was Dien in a frail canoe. Her chances for survival seemed to me absolutely non-existent. I tried to drive these destructive fears from my mind, and with the abating of the storm I partially succeeded, and hope was at last again renewed when the warriors we had given up for lost returned to the village. Not a canoe had been lost, nor not a man. It was a marvel of extraordinary seamanship. The first concern of the Reuvens was to rebuild their village, and in this work everyone joined, including the women and children. When this work was completed, I told Rotai that I was going to repair the damage done to the sailing canoe. He asked me if I wanted any help, but I told him that I would need no one other than my slave Lubra. He did not insist upon my taking anyone else, nor did he put any watch over me this time. Evidently he had accepted me as a full-fledged member of the tribe, and so Lubra and I went down to the seashore to commence our task. Having found that I had no intention of harming her, the girl's spirits had returned and she seemed quite content and happy. While I worked on the canoe, I had her gather food and prepare it. She also collected a supply of water from the trees and filled bamboo containers with it. These things I hid in the forest near my work. I made some bone fishhooks for her and taught her how to fish in the quiet waters of the inlet. The fish she caught, she smoked and dried and packed away for future use. I did not acquaint her with my plan, but I had to place some trust in her, as it was necessary to caution her to silence relative to our collection and storage of food and water. She asked no questions, and that was a good sign, for a person who asks no questions can usually keep his own counsel. She had been a prisoner of the Kovans for a considerable period, probably for a number of years of outer earthly time. She had been there when Dien and Dugat had been brought from the mainland, and had become well acquainted with Dien, who told her that after she had escaped from the man-eating giants of Azar, she had also succeeded in escaping from Dugat, but that he had pursued her and that the very moment he had overtaken her they had both been captured by the Reuvens. I shuddered to think of all that my lovely Dien had been compelled to endure because her love for me had driven her forth in search of me. That she should die without knowing that I was comparatively safe seemed a cruel blow of fate. She could not even know that I had escaped from the Jukans after I had left her in the cave and gone back to rescue Zor and Klito. My work upon the canoe progressed nicely, but I was still highly impatient for the moment when I could put my plan into execution. The only danger now was that it might be discovered if some Reuven stumbled upon our cache of food and water. I would have hard work explaining that away. At last it was finished, and on the way back to the village I warned Lubra to be sure not to mention this fact. Certainly not, she said. Do you think I want to give our plan away? Our plan? Why do you call it our plan? I asked. You don't even know what I have in mind. Oh yes I do, she said. And it is our plan because I have worked and helped you. That is right, I said. And whatever the plan is, it is ours together. And we will carry it out together, and we will say nothing about it to anyone else. Is that right? Absolutely, she said. And what do you think the plan is? I asked her. You are going back to the mainland in that canoe which goes without paddles, and you are taking me with you to point the direction to Suvi, because you cannot do it yourself. That is why you chose me from among the other slaves of Kovie. I am not a fool, David. It is all quite plain to me, and you need have no fear that I shall divulge our secret to anyone. I liked the use of the word our. It almost assured her loyalty, even aside from anything else that she had said. I was very fortunate, I said. In what way? She demanded. In finding you instead of another slave on Kovie. You are intelligent and loyal, and you also know when you are well off. But how did you know that I could not find my way to the mainland without someone's help? Who in Suvi does not know all about David, Emperor of Pellucidar? She demanded. Who does not know that he is from another world, and that he can do almost everything better than we of Pellucidar, but that if he is taken out of sight of familiar landmarks, he could never find his way home again? That is a marvel to us Pellucidarians, something which we cannot understand. It must be a strange world in which you lived, where no one dared go far from home, knowing that he could never find it again. But we do find our way around even better than Pellucidarians, I said, because we not only can find our way home, but we can find our way to any place in our world. That, she said, is incomprehensible. I had been working on the canoe very steadily, and of course there being no way of measuring time, I had no way of knowing how long we had been absent from the village. Having had our own food supply, we had eaten occasionally, but neither of us slept. The fact that both of us were very sleepy should have told us that we had been absent for a considerable period of time, and this must have been true, for when we returned we discovered that preparations had been almost completed for a huge feast to celebrate our victory over the Kovans. Everybody was very excited about it, but all that Lubra and I wanted to do was to go to our huts and sleep. Ore, who often sought my company when I was in the village, asked me what in the world Lubra and I could be doing to be away so much. We are working on the canoe that goes without paddles, I replied. I shall have to come with you the next time you go, she said, because I have never seen it. Well, that was just what I didn't want because I had planned that the next time Lubra and I went to the canoe we would never return. We had only returned this time in order to get a good sleep before we set out upon our voyage, but I said, that will be fine, Ore, but why don't you wait until I have finished it? Oh, I can come then too and have a ride in it, she said. Do you know, David, I wish that you were not white. I cannot imagine a finer mate than you. I think I shall ask Rotai to make an exception in your case, so that I may be your mate. Because I have a slave? I asked, laughing. No, she said. I should get rid of Lubra because I think you like her too well. I would not care to have a rival. The young lady was quite frank. Sometimes these Paleolithic maidens are, but not always. Dian had been just the opposite. Well, I said, you may make somebody a fine mate but not me. I already have one. Or shrugged. Oh, you'll never see her again, she said. You've got to live here all the rest of your life, and you might as well have a mate. Forget it, or I said, and pick out a nice man of your own race. Do you mean that you don't want me? She demanded angrily. It is not a question of wanting you or not wanting you, I replied. It is that, as I told you before, I already have a mate, and in my country we never have but one at a time. That's not the reason, she snapped. You're in love with Lubra. That's why you go out together alone all the time. Any fool could see that. Well, have it your own way, or I said. I'm going to get some sleep now. And I turned and left her. When I awoke, I was thoroughly rested. And shortly after, Lubra awoke. When we came out of the hut, we saw that they were already gathering for the feast. I was ravenously hungry and wanted to eat, and I knew that Lubra must want to also. The fact that a feast was going on gave us an excellent opportunity to escape without detection, since every member of the tribe would be in the village during the feast, and there would be no likelihood of anyone discovering us while we launched the canoe and loaded it up with our supplies. I suggested this to Lubra. I think we can get out of here now without being seen, I said. They will think that we are still asleep in our hut, if they miss us, which they may not. Good, she said. We can keep the huts between us and them until we enter the forest. And so we bade farewell to the village of the Reuvens for what we hoped would be the last time. We hurried to the canoe, and with our combined efforts, managed finally to drag it into the water. Then we hastened to load it with our provisions. We had just about completed our work when I saw someone approaching through the forest from the direction of the village. It was too late now to conceal what we were doing, and I knew that whoever it was would know what we were contemplating the moment that they saw us loading the canoe with water and food. Lubra was returning from the cache with her arms full, and I was just starting back for another load, when Oare burst upon the scene. So that's what you're doing, she flared angrily. You are going to run away, and you are going to take that white-faced thing with you. You guessed it the first time, I said. Well, you're not going to do it. I'll see to that, she snapped. But if you want to escape from Ruva, I'll go with you instead of that girl. If you won't do that, I'll give the alarm. But I have to take Lubra, I said. Otherwise, I could never find the mainland. I thought maybe by explaining I could mollify her. You know, Oare, that you could not show me how to reach the mainland. Very well, take her along too then as guide. But I am going as your mate. No, Oare, I said. I am sorry, but that would not work out. You won't take me? She asked. No, Oare. Her eyes flashed angrily for a moment, and then she turned and walked back into the forest. It seemed to me that she had given up very easily. Lubra and I hurried as fast as we could to load the remainder of our provisions in the canoe. We couldn't afford to leave without taking everything that we had collected, for we had no idea how long we would be on the water before we reached the mainland. We had stowed away the last load, and Lubra had taken her place in the canoe, when I heard the sounds of approaching men, and I knew that Oare had returned to the village and reported what she had discovered. I pushed off and paddled away from shore just as 40 or 50 Reuven warriors burst into sight. Rotai was in the lead, and he shouted to me to come back, but I turned the nose of the canoe toward the open sea and started to hoist the sail. There was a slight offshore wind, and it seemed an eternity before the sail caught the little breeze that reached us. Both Lubra and I paddled frantically, but if we did not get more wind, we never could escape the Reuvens, who were now piling into their canoes to take up the pursuit. The leading canoe shot out from the shore, but now we were far enough out so that we were catching a little more wind and moving just a little more rapidly. However, they were overhauling us, and all the time Rotai was shouting for me to come back, and his canoe was drawing nearer. They came within a spear throw of us, but now we were holding about even. Rotai stood up in the canoe with his spear poised to throw. Come back, he said, or you die. Lubra had crossed from Covier in the canoe, and since then she had asked many questions relative to its handling. Whether or not she could steer it I didn't know, but I had to take the chance, and so I called her to me and told her to take the steering paddle. Then I fitted an arrow to my bow and stood up. Rotai, I do not want to kill you, I said, but if you don't lay down that spear I shall have to. He hesitated a moment. A gust of wind bellied our sail bravely, and the canoe leaped ahead just as Rotai hurled his weapon. I knew that it would fall short, and so I did not shoot him, for I liked Rotai and he had been kind to me. Do not forget, Rotai, I called back, that I could have killed you but that I did not. I am your friend, but I want to return to my own country. We were pulling away from them rapidly now. For a while they followed us, but seeing the futility of further pursuit, they at last turned back. Chapter 28. How long that voyage lasted, God only knows. A dozen times we were attacked by huge nameless monsters, and 3 times we ran into storms that threatened to terminate our voyage and our lives simultaneously, But somehow we pulled through until at last we were faced with the knowledge that our food and water would soon be gone. Lubra proved to be a very wonderful girl. She was courageous and uncomplaining. I felt sorry for her. You would have been better off on Ruva, Lubra, I said. It is commencing to look very much as though I had led you to death instead of to freedom. Whatever happens, I am content, David, she said. I would rather be dead than a slave. Your being with me is a strange coincidence, Lubra, which I have never before mentioned. It was another girl from Suvi who was going to lead me toward Sari. We were both prisoners of the Jukins, and then of the man-eating giants of Azar. Whether she died there or escaped them, I do not know. What was her name? Asked Lubra. Clito, I said. I knew her, said Lubra. We were children together before I was stolen. On and on we sailed, Lubra my living compass pointing the way. We had rationed the food to a point where we had barely enough to sustain life, and only 2 or 3 sips of water a day. We were both weak and emaciated. We had had poor luck with our fishing, possibly because neither one of us was from a maritime nation. On land I could have brought in plenty of game, but out here on the water, although it teemed with food, I seemed scarcely ever to make a direct hit. Why that should have been, I do not know, for I have become an excellent shot with bow and arrow. After the last morsel of food was consumed, we made a catch with one of my bone fish hooks. It was a little fish about a foot long, but we cut it in two and devoured it raw. Shortly after this, our water supply was exhausted. I prayed for another storm with rain, but the sky remained clear, and the merciless noonday sun beat down upon us, and across that wide expanse of unfriendly ocean there was no sign of land. Lubra was lying under her shelter in the bottom of the canoe. She spoke to me in a weak voice. David, she asked, are you afraid to die? I do not want to die, I replied, but I am not afraid to. Possibly it is another wonderful adventure in which we shall go to a new country and meet new people and many of our old friends who have gone before us, and after a while we shall all be gathered there. I hope so, David, she said, for I am dying now. I hate to desert you, David, for companionship is all either of us have left now. When I am gone, you will be alone, and it is not good to die alone. I turned away my head to hide the tears that came to my eyes, and as I did so I saw something that brought an exclamation of astonishment and incredulity to my lips. It was a sail. What was a sail doing upon that ocean where there could be no sails? And then a possibility of the truth dawned upon me. Lubra, I cried. You shall not die. We are saved, Lubra. What do you mean, David? She asked. Land. No, I said. A sail. And if this is the Lural Az, as you have told me it must be, it can only be a friendly sail. I changed our course and headed for the strange ship, which I soon saw was bearing down upon us. They must have seen our sail, too. As we came nearer, I recognized the vessel as one of the type that Perry had designed and built after his first disastrous attempt to build a battleship. I could have wept for joy. I lowered our sail and waited. The little vessel hove to beside us and tossed me a line, and as I looked up into the faces peering down from above, I recognized Jah the Mezop, who had commanded one of the first vessels of our fleet. David, he cried. You? It has been hundreds of sleeps since we gave you up for dead. Lubra was too weak to clamber aboard Jah's vessel. She could only raise herself to a sitting position, and I was too weak to help her, but willing hands soon lifted us both aboard, and as I reached the deck a woman ran toward me and threw her arms about me. It was Dien the Beautiful. After they had given us a little food and water, and we were somewhat revived and strengthened, Dien told me her story. She had helped Dugad escape from Covier, on Dugad's explicit promise that he would respect her and help her to return to Sari, but he had broken his word to her, and she had killed him. Of this metal are the beautiful daughters of Amaz. Then she had paddled on toward the mainland, guided unerringly by her homing instinct. She had evidently been out of the track of the great storm which I had feared must have spelled her doom, but she had passed safely through the 3 storms that Lubra and I had encountered. We are back in Sari now, contented and happy. Lubra was returned to Suvi, and the warriors who escorted her brought back word that made me still happier, and also gave me some slight idea as to the length of time that I was a prisoner on Ruva, for the word that they brought me was that Zor and Clito had reached Suvi safely, and that they had mated and already had a little son,